Thank you, Roshi. It really is wonderful to be back with you all today on this first day of autumn. Uh, since many of us are both Christian and Zen practitioners, I'd like to address one of the many issues that are sometimes brought up is showing that the differences between the two traditions, and as I always find in my life and practice, if you look closer, they're not so different. And in this case, I'm talking about the role of suffering or the phenomenon of suffering. Christians will often say, well, the Buddhists don't have anything like, we have the suffering of Jesus on the cross. He redeemed the world by the blood of his cross. And of course, you certainly hear Buddhist practitioners, especially native Asian Buddhists, who say, what is all this stuff in Christianity with, the bloody sacrifice on the cross and Jesus redeeming the world? What is all this stuff? Well, what is it indeed? And I think if we, as I say, if we do look more closely, we can find, the similarities. And a lot of it will require a purging of our Christian understanding too, as I'll point out. But I would say that both traditions, and in fact, any valid religious tradition, addresses the human condition, what the human condition actually is, and addresses it with compassion. So, in Buddhism, it's clear with, the Four Noble Truths. The Buddha went on his journey because he discovered the human condition of, sickness, old age, and death, the suffering of the human condition, and that's the first noble truth that he formulated. That the life is dukkha, it's suffering, the inadequacy and insufficiency that will cause suffering. But the second noble truth is that a lot of it is our own response or reaction to the suffering of the world. Or you might put it this way, as Eckhart Tolle does. Pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. Suffering in that restricted sense that the Buddha means, that the suffering that comes from our clinging and our resisting and our own mental talking to ourselves about the human condition and about the human condition that we have, the suffering. And that therefore the third noble truth is, well, to let go of that, resistance and that clinging. I think often of that koan about the monk asking the teacher, it's when I'm sitting, sometimes it's so hot, sometimes it's so cold. In other words, the suffering of the human condition in that mild sense. And of course, the master says, well, if you're cold, sit cold. And if you're hot, sit hot. Stop resisting, in other words. And that can be the gateway to, a real enlightenment once you accept, the human condition. Part of the issue with Christianity's view of suffering is that, we try to find the cause for it. And you remember, of course, the Buddha's great exhortation. If you've got an arrow stuck in you, you don't say, I wonder where this arrow came from and what kind of arrow is it? And, all this is seeking explanation, whereas, of course, how do you get it out? What's the response to the suffering? Not try to find the cause for it. So, for example, I say we need a purgation of our view of the human condition in Christianity. For example, the fall. We're a fallen race. We've created all this mess for ourselves. So we need to have someone come and clean it up. Okay, we have to have a radical re-examination of what we call the fall. There was no one human being who sat in the garden naked, eating an apple, all that, imagery. As many modern theologians have pointed out with various other better explanations, for example, it's simply duality. Good and evil, the tree of good and evil. And we eat that apple when we're born into this world because we're living in a world of duality. And then that brings along, all the confusion and free will and makes me making mistakes and all of that. But there's not something that has to be cleaned up in that sense, of a radical sacrifice, which I'll come back to in a moment. Sorry if you can hear a car outside the door, the window here. This is New York City. So, sorry. The so the response to the human condition, then, in terms of our own living practices, call it the 8 Beatitudes, or call it the Noble Eightfold Path. I mean, there's a response of a practice of learning to deal with that human condition. But the whole notion that Jesus had to redeem us by the blood of his cross and placate an angry father by his atonement, all right, that's horrible nonsense. It's evil nonsense that has destroyed souls for centuries. Read Elizabeth Johnson's book on creation and the cross. So there was no angry father that needed to be placated by a bloody sadistic sacrifice. This is all horrible. So what is it? And if we look at the cross and Jesus' accepting of the cross, more calmly and benignly, we'll see that it isn't that much different from the Buddhist ideal. So what happened? Jesus really received the human condition, first of all, by being born, by being human, but then by undergoing this terrible injustice and cruelty and all the stuff that was piled on him. It's so often part of the human condition, injustice and cruelty, suffering in that radical sense. And the response was forgiveness, not the resistance to the suffering, getting angrier, full of revenge and hate. The second noble truth. Suffering is caused by our resistance. So to accept in forgiveness and trust in reality, call it trust in the Father, call it trust in the universe, accept and trust and abandonment, into your hands I commend my spirit. And Father, forgive them, they know not what they do. Bringing the compassion of forgiveness and trust in equanimity, all these equanimity of great Buddhist ideal as well, into the human condition. That is what redeemed us. In other words, brought a powerful current of love and forgiveness into the very core of reality that is there for all times and all places. That's how it works. And of course, it also tells us, reminds us, seeing Jesus on the cross, what we do to the prophets and the seers and the great people who come among us is normally we kill them, or the system kills them because they shake us up and we don't like that. That's the other part of it. But in terms of the actual mechanics, if you will, how the cross works for redeeming us, is bringing that powerful current of love and forgiveness and trust and patience into the world. And so that's a powerful force that exists in our universe. And so this does bring up the issue, so did he redeem us? This is the old jiriki, tariki, the old other power, self-power thing again. But look, if we look at the traditions, more fully, we have the bodhisattvas, we have the Buddha himself, we have Christ, we have the bodhisattvas who bring, freedom from suffering through all sentient beings. They're there as powerful forces. Of course, you have, the more evident things like the Pure Land Buddhism, where you actually invoke the Buddha, and of course, Buddhist practitioners throughout the world invoke the Buddha all the time. They're not wrong, but the Buddha is not separate from us. But these powerful energies are there, bringing compassion and hope to the world. And look at the metta meditations that the Tibetans especially do. The loving kindness where you're spreading to the world. The energy is coming from within you out into the world. This is the way we believe that it comes from Christ or the saints into the world, the bodhisattvas into the world. Is it other power or self-power? We're not different from them. But for example, in the Tonglen meditation, when you take in the actual sufferings and pain of the world, even the sin, if you might call it that, the evil, and transform it in yourself. Well, what do you think? That's what we mean by Christ doing that, or our doing that. We're all called to do that, to be agents and vehicles for this compassion and love in the world. We address the human condition, first of all, in ourselves, by recognizing and then practicing and becoming, enlightened with compassion and love and hope. But then we radiate that out into the world. And that's all we mean by Christ doing that, or the Buddha doing that, or the Bodhisattvas or the saints doing that. And that is our vocation in this world and beyond, to be vehicles of compassion and love and forgiveness, receiving it and then emanating it and radiating it into the world. Interesting today, as some of you Catholics may know, today is the memory of Padre Pio, the famous Padre Pio, who was a Franciscan schismatic in the 20th century, who received the wounds of Christ, just like St. Francis did in his own body. Well, that's a symbol and an actual vehicle of the pouring out of compassion, taking on the suffering of the world. He was very well known for being a wonderful, compassionate spiritual counselor. The hospital built in his name. That's the important thing, not the particular symbol of the stigmata, but what it represents. It represents that we bear in our humanity, like Christ, we bear in our humanity this human condition and the suffering of the human condition. But they become, our wounds, like Christ, become radiant vehicles of love and compassion and forgiveness. If we don't resist the human condition, but accept it and transform it, we transform our pain. We don't transmit the pain, as Richard Rohr says. You either transform it or you transmit it. So whom are we going to imitate? Buddha, Christ, Bodhisattvas, saints, or are we going to become victims of the suffering by resisting it and rebelling against it and becoming angry and hateful and vengeful? So it's the same dynamic. It's the same dynamic in both traditions. Take on the human condition in compassion and love and forgiveness. Receive the suffering and transform the suffering. Make your wounds vehicles of light. Whatever tradition you're following, that's what's happening. So we got to get rid of some of the crazy, horrible ideas we do have in Christianity about suffering, as if suffering itself is wonderful, No, but we accept it, and we transform it. Whether you're Buddhist or Christian or both. I like the both part. And finally, just so lest this become too lugubrious a view of the human condition, don't forget that joy and love and joy is a fundamental energy of the universe, as Teilhard and others have said. I just want to close with this quote from the Page a Day Zen calendar from a few days ago. It's one of my favorite, spiritual reading, the Page a Day Zen calendar. This is from Philo of Alexandria. Probably many of you have never even heard of him, but he deserves to be better known. He's a contemporary of Jesus. He's a Jewish mystic, and we're celebrating the High Holy Days, of course, right during this time. A Jewish mystic and a Neoplatonic mystic, and if you've never read him, look it up. Philo, Philo, Philo of Alexandria, that mystical place I'm going to visit next January. So here's what he says. The face of the wise person is not somber or austere, contracted by anxiety and sorrow, but precisely the opposite. Radiant and serene, filled with a vast delight, which often makes the wise the most playful of people. So hopefully we can be playful as we discover the peace and the joy of what life really means in the midst of it all. Okay, thank you.